Thank you. Stephen, if you want, I can have the YouTube open and just do a thumbs up when I see it.
So this means I have to start.
When I give you like this, then you can start. And there are 53 people right now already, so that's cool.
You will make it available later?
Right now, yeah,
yeah,
already, so that's cool. Okay.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to this conference about how to degrow. So this is organized by the Climate Strike Switzerland, and we're very happy to be here with amazing speakers tonight. And all alongside, you will have the possibility to ask questions if you want in the chat. And we, as co-moderator, we take care of taking this question and trying to answer them if we can. And shortly, I will present you this group. Has this proposition of conference was done by the System Change Group that is actually a working group in the Climate Strike that we formed around the Climate Action Plan. So the Climate Action Plan was a large plan on how to come to a net zero scenario for 2030, and also using like climate justice principle and other stuff. And in this project, what we want to do is to focus a little bit more on the economic and political system, as it is very important for us to try to change also some of the logic of the system if we want to change it, because that's what we want today. We want a system change and we need it. And for that also in this group, what we do is that we look at different theories of change. And tonight what we will do, it's like an exploration, a start into the degrowth paradigm. And for that, I mean, we will open the discussion, but you will be very welcome to join our group, the degrowth one or either the system change group. So every person, social movement, expert or organization, everyone is welcome, and we need actually everyone to go forward. And now I will just let everyone introduce themselves. Maybe I will start and you can then finish the round. So I'm Steven. I come from near Lausanne in Epalinges. So it is in Vaud, and I will be one of the co-moderator tonight, and my pronouns are he, him. Marion, you want to continue?
Yeah, thank you. So my name is Marion, and I'm also part of the System Change group of Climate Strike. I live in Zurich currently, and I'll be co-moderating with Stephen this event tonight, and my pronouns are she. Julia, if you want to go next.
So my name is Julia Steinberger. I am a professor at the University of Lausanne at the Institute of Geography and Sustainability. My research topic is well-being within planetary limits, and I consider myself part of the degrowth camp of things. Glad to be here tonight. I guess I should also say I'm an IPCC lead author, but I don't speak on behalf of the IPCC. I'm not here as an IPCC spokesperson.
Yeah, my name is Irmi Seidl. Good evening. I'm economist. I'm head of a research unit at the Swiss Federal Research Institute for Forest, Snow and Landscape, where we are doing different environmental research. I'm an adjunct professor of the University of Zurich, and I'm working also on post-growth society.
Thank you very much. So what we're going to do now, before diving into the different topics and questions we want to go into, is I'll give a quick introduction to the topic of degrowth so that everyone who's following us and watching the live right now can have a sort of basic common understanding of what we're going to talk about today. So I'll just now share my screen so that I can share this. Are you able to see it? Yeah, good. Okay, good. So let me start by a question that seems basic, but is maybe not always so basic. So what is degrowth? The reason why this question is not so basic is because degrowth encompasses many different aspects of our society. It is rooted in environmental debates, but also political debates, social debates, and it's really a social movement that encompasses many different aspects of our society. And I guess there's one core thing that is at the base, at the source of all of this, is that degrowth defendants or the degrowth movement is a critique of the continuous economic growth paradigm. And more specifically, it's a critique of something that we call green growth, which is the idea that we're able to live as a society within planetary boundaries while keeping on being able to grow and have economic growth. And so defendants of degrowth criticize this green growth and say that this is not possible. And for green growth to be possible, we need to have something that we call absolute decoupling, which means that we would be able to completely separate the fact that we can economically grow constantly and that we use more and more, that we use natural resources and that we emit CO2. So if we're able to separate these two things and have continuous economic growth and not augmenting what we emit and how we pollute, then we could have absolute decoupling and green growth could be possible. But the degrowth movement says that's not possible. And they usually have many different arguments on why that is. And there's more and more support of these arguments. There's more and more evidence that this is indeed not possible. I'm going to go through some of them right now. So one of them is something called the rebound effect, which is typically an answer, a response of consumers to optimization. So it could be seen as when the product gets cheaper, then the reaction of people would be that they actually start buying more of it. And if you take that example to the topic of the environment, then you could see it, for example, if you think of cars and you think that you make a car less polluting, for example, by electrifying the car, then this could result in people ending up driving their car more or buying more cars, or it could end up in more investment being made into the private car sector and not more money being put into the public sector. So this idea that by making something more efficient or less polluting, this could result in more of it being used, and thereby it would even out the savings that we could have made. The second argument would be something called problem shifting, which means that by improving one aspect of something, one aspect of a product, you could have negative consequences on some other aspects. So for example, if you think about it in terms of renewable energies, then you could think, of course, it's good because it's taking us away from fossil fuels and it's polluting less in terms of CO2. But then if you think of the amount of resources that they need, it's quite big in terms of its impact on different types of resources, land use, and these kinds of questions. So one thing could impact the other. One other aspect that I also find quite important is that the whole idea of green growth is based on the idea that we have enough technology change or enough or appropriate technology change that would enable to have this sort of decoupling. So technologies that would enable us to have more production and economic growth, while this production not meaning more resource use, for example. And this assumption of technological change is just a big assumption. And there's no evidence that this is possible. That this is possible in terms of physical limits. It's not possible. There's no evidence that this is actually possible. And so degrowth defendants then say, okay, well, given this, then we need to downscale how much we produce and how much we consume. So we need to somehow shrink our economy for us to have a system that's within planetary boundaries. And then the question then that I find the most interesting is then to think, how do we then decouple prosperity from GDP growth, from economic growth, because the system that we currently have is everything is based on growth. We define a country being prosperous or people's well-being to be defined by how their country or the place they're in is economically growing. So how do we make sure that these things are separate so that even when we don't have GDP growth, we have a growth in prosperity and well-being? And one image that I like that maybe you've seen before, because it's quite a used image, is this one where it's important to say that degrowth is not about having less of something in the sense of having less growth, because then it would look like this elephant who's in recession right now. But it's about creating something that completely is different, an alternative system, a new system, basically. And I like always the analogy with the vegetarian diet, for example. So if you tell somebody who really loves meat that you're taking meat away from their plate, then they directly picture their plate without meat, and then they see they have less of meat and they find their plate is sad and they feel like something was taken away from them. But actually what you want to tell them is that they need to find a new recipe. They completely need to reinvent how they feed themselves, and then you start having a happy vegetarian diet, let's say. In the same way, I find it important to not think of degrowth simply as less growth, but as completely reimagining how do we live in a system that's no longer based on growth, but where people can be happy and have well-being. So I guess the core points is about this downscaling as production and consumption in industrialist countries mainly, but it's also about striving for more social justice, striving for more well-being, striving for equality, and probably also maybe not most importantly, but also striving for environmental sustainability. So it's downscaling for upscaling other parts of what our system is about. And this requires obviously a shift in values, because it requires reimagining how we live and how we consume and what we consume and how we define our happiness, let's say. And what today we're going to go into are 3 different topics that within this system change group we've come to understand as important and that we wanted to have some external expertise on. Is the concept of work. So the question of work, because a lot of people who defend the idea of growth is that growth is the major reason why we don't have massive unemployment. And then in a world where we downscale production and consumption, how do we deal with work? What does work even mean in this sort of new society? And then the second topic we'll go into is the question of values. As I mentioned before, transition into a degrowth society means rethinking our values and shifting our values and deciding which sectors are important, which sectors can we get rid of, in a sense, and who gets to decide on these values and what these values are is very important. And then the third point, and this is where we're going to spend most of our time, is to think about the transition to this degrowth society and what are the measures that we can now take to build a path to this alternative society. How do we have a transition that is inclusive? How do we not leave people behind? And all these questions that are very important, especially in the context of what our system change group is trying to make, because we're trying to have, well, a concrete plan for a system change. So before I ask Professor Steinberger and Professor Seidl to just add some points on what I just said, I want to just tell the audience that you're free to ask your questions on the chat, and that we're going to answer these questions one topic at a time. So if you ask questions about the topic of work, once we get into it, then we're going to cover these questions at the end of this topic. And so now I want to open the floor to Irmi and Julia. If you, I don't know who wants to start on maybe adding something on what I just said, on what major points of degrowth you find, what are the things that you find most important, or if there's something in my presentation that you want to emphasize before we dive into the topic of growth. And I will now stop sharing my screen. Yes, good. So I don't know which one wants to go first.
Me?
Irmi. Okay, so thanks. Yeah, you have mentioned quite a lot. What I would add My argument is more from the we call it post-growth society, and not so much from degrowth, because at the beginning we didn't want to say we have to shrink for different reasons. And our argument is quite strongly on growth independence. I mean, and I want to say that I think also if you want to get degrowth, whatever it be, we need to get systems growth independent. And I think this is something, a major problem which we have now, and I think we will talk about that later, that there is growth dependence in quite a lot of subsystems of our society. And I think, and I might, a couple of them are already mentioned and discussed, and others in particular, I would say the social security system is not so much mentioned so far, and there's not that much knowledge how to change. Yeah.
I think so. I think Irmi's point is really, really important in terms of these systems. I guess the other thing I would add is that in terms of our current economy, it's not just that it has certain growth dynamics. It's also that it's about what growth protects, or what growth necessitate, or what are the things that necessitate growth. And this has to do with specific industries, the way they're set up, their profit imperatives, and so on. And they really sit at the heart of our economies, and they're sort of driving us, metaphorically and literally, because the automotive industry is part of it, off a cliff. So I think it's not just about the term growth itself, it's also what lies under it in terms of growth imperatives. So we basically have this dual problem. So as Irmi said, we have growth dependence of core systems we want to protect, like a functioning society, governments, pension funds, I don't know what else, welfare systems. But we also have growth drivers, which have to do with these really strong locations of power, which are also locations of power that are averse to acting on climate or shrinking their negative impacts. And I think the question of degrowth is sort of trying to, so I consider myself to be more on the degrowth side, but I think that's one of the things that we're trying to get at is what these underlying systems are and how they have to be transformed and what it's going to take.
So I guess I will make the transition to the first topic. We're going to discuss a little bit more about work. As Marion said, work, I mean, it's central in our life today. So it's no way we can get out of this question easily. So we need to tackle it at first. And especially because we start often by saying that, okay, to produce more, we need to work less. And there is a question can come after to us, everyone, activists, people pledging for such new society. So I will ask this question and it will maybe lead us further after, but it's like, in the present system, we need growth to provide work, it's clear. So won't there be like massive unemployment when we try to degrow, so to start and even to be in this transition? So I guess that's the first question we need to try to answer.
So I guess that's since, do you want, no, go ahead, Irmi, go ahead.
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. I guess I thought that since that was more of a straight like degrowth question, anyway, but I think that because, so indeed you're right. So right now, if we have economic degrowth, it's known as a recession, it's a crisis, people lose their jobs. As we're seeing now with COVID, as we saw in the 2008 financial crisis. So the question of the role of growth and work is it's a complex one, and we know, well, it's not that complex in the normal state of sort of current growth-based economic systems. You lose growth, a whole bunch of sectors get into trouble, people lose their jobs. However, even that's not completely an iron law. So you have societies where they have recessions and it's not a huge employment crisis, such as Japan for the past almost more than a decade, I think. So you can protect people's jobs using the mechanisms of government or the mechanisms of social security. You basically make employment still happen. So we know that we can that can already happen even in a sort of normal current economic system. And under degrowth, the question is, it's less a question of the total amount of economic activity is related to a total amount of work. Like, that's not the way the economy works. It's more what we do with the resources we have at our disposal. And with the resources we have at our disposal, one of the things we are interdependent on each other. So we need each other to be able to work. And one of the ways you can see it as shifting the amount of money we spend on, for instance, natural resources, petrol, really inefficient energy systems, so all the sort of bad stuff that we spend on that results in environmental impacts, we can actually shift that to work. And that's something that's been proposed for a long time, for instance, under the rubric of the ecological fiscal reform or tax reform, where you basically make environmental bads a lot more expensive and work a lot cheaper, for instance, by shifting the costs of Social Security and so on. So it's not like there's one amount of economic activity and one amount of work. We can really have a lot of freedom on what to do there.
Yes, I think what Julia said is very important. How can we avoid that people get unemployed if we have a system change or kind of degrowth of certain sectors? I would like first to go to the mechanism why we are growth dependent on work, and this is this kind of productivity trap, as Jackson calls it. The situation is that we usually have some productivity growth each year. This is because there is technical progress, because there is organizational progress, and this frees people, frees them from their employment. And to employ these people, we need more growth. But at the same time, as we have growth, we have technical progress because new machineries are installed, and we have technical progress anyhow. So again, people are replaced. So I mentioned this because when we create jobs for people, we have to look at this productivity conundrum. And these working places, which Julia says the government can create or anybody else can create, should be places which are not that capital intensive, but rather work intensive. And we have a lot of need for them. This is in culture, it's in education, it's in health. And I want to mention it's also in agriculture, because now our agriculture system is very capital intense. We have a lot of chemicals, we have machinery, and we all know that if we have a more biological, organic agriculture, we need more human power. So we have also to invent means how to bring more work in agriculture and also how to bring more work in other spheres. And I think to reduce this dependency on economic growth for work, we, as Julia said, we can use money to create new jobs, but we should also focus on this productivity dynamic. So for example, in South Korea, I heard recently, they have applied a robot fee tax to slow down the productivity of the system. So we could use, for example, such things. And what we haven't mentioned yet is the working time reduction, which, to my opinion, is indispensable. We will have to do that. We will have to share the work on more shoulders, which also demands that we recreate how we organize work, but also then we quite quickly come to the social security system, how this can be maintained with less work. And maybe a last thing, which we also have to mention, is that work is replaced now because it's expensive, because the social security fees are on work, and the taxes are on income. And these taxes have increased in the last 60, 70 years. So what is also important to reduce the taxes on labor and instead to charge other taxes. And we know also, if we look at the time series, that since the 60s, the tax on capital has been reduced and the tax on environmental resources hasn't increased. So we will have to reshift what we tax. And I think then we lower the pressure on growth to create work.
So thank you. You're already bringing so many points. And I guess in this topic, we're going to dive into two of them a little bit more. I think it's clear right now that some sectors need to grow, and you've already highlighted what kind of sector it should be, but maybe we can be even more clear. It could be, you said agriculture, but it could be also public transport. It could be also care work that we often forget, and many other of this. And there is a social security around that. And one of the proposals that we discussed in the system change group in the degrowth, but not only, is the idea of job guarantee. That could really be like a huge mechanism also to help to share the work, also to provide good work. It is a tool for government also like to decide, and with the people, where we want to invest our time. And if people want to have a work, they will have a decent work, a work that is well paid. And what do you think about this idea of job guarantee? Is it like a mechanism that is very central around that?
You're muted still.
So I think it's very sympathetic, but I think it's maybe politically not that realistic. I mean, we had already times with job guarantees, and I think in France there was some time with job guarantees, and I think it's okay to discuss it, but I would foster the idea how to create new jobs which we can finance. Where is need for jobs? So there is a huge amount of need for jobs in the ecological sector. There is a huge amount in the education and care and things like this. So create jobs there. And I think, I mean, it depends also on the countries, but in Switzerland, we don't need a job guarantee. I think create jobs in these areas, reduce working time, which anyhow suits to the values of the young generation, or introduce systems like, I mean, recently somebody told me about the idea of revenu de transition écologique, such things. And you can, and I think we can create jobs without having the public fight. Because I mean, in Switzerland, if you have a job guarantee, you will have a public vote and you will not win it. So I think we should discuss where do we put our resources. I'm quite pragmatic in such things. Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting perspective. I guess because I'm Swiss, but I'm also new to Switzerland since I'm just back, and I'm also seeing what's happening around in other places. In some ways, it seems to me like one of the reasons the job guarantee is not such a bad idea to have at the back of one's pocket, at least, is because if we're in a time of transformation, and I'm thinking of it very pragmatically from the perspective of the well-being of populations in a time of crisis. If you have this massive transformation of the economy, that's very disturbing to people, right? That's something where you're asking people to put up with a lot. You're asking people to put up with job changes of their ways of life. You know, even a positive change is still like sometimes reasonably traumatic. Like so even if it's going to be good eventually, you're asking people to change a lot of things about the way we live and about the way they interact with the economy. And I think that having the option, that knowing that part of this program can be this security of knowing that whatever happens, you're going to have a job, you're going to be able to provide for the people you love, and you're going to have the economic security, I think can be quite reassuring. So I think that, for instance, in the US, the Green New Deal is only popular because it includes a job guarantee, because otherwise you're asking too many people to look at a change, which might be positive overall, but for their sector, for their work, it might not be. So that's one thing. You were asking about which sectors are going to grow, or that's also part of this question, right? One of the reasons I think work time reduction is a very nice idea. I think work sharing is a good idea. I don't think we should be working so much or so hard. There's no purpose in it. We can, we know that we can do well with a lot less, but it also seems to me that the transformation that we have to, if we think we're going to have a chance of having this transformation to keep global warming down below, 1.5 degrees or as close to there as we can stay possibly, that's a lot of work. We are talking about retrofitting every single building in the world. We are talking about completely changing cities, completely changing transportation systems. We're talking about retooling factories to allow public transit and low impact mobility modes. There's a lot to be done. I mean, maybe after that, and creating the renewable energy infrastructure, putting solar panels up everywhere we possibly can, et cetera. So maybe after that, maybe we have a lot of work to do now, and then after 20 years, and the other thing is protecting ecosystems, making sure that we, we rewild, reforest, so that we're less vulnerable to floods, because we know that these impacts are coming. We need to protect ourselves against climate impacts, and we need to protect ecosystems and accompany ecosystems so that they can adapt as the climate is changing already now very rapidly. So that's a huge amount of work. So maybe when we stabilize, maybe if we get there, if we get to a stable climate, if we get to we build this new infrastructure that allows us to live without so much impact, then we can relax and have work time reduction and job sharing and all that. But I don't know. It would be nice to do the math.
Yeah. I mean, Julia, you're very right. And I want to point to a topic which is really not investigated. How much do we have additional work if we don't have any more fossil fuels? Because, I mean, maybe you have heard about this calculation that everybody employs 60 energy slaves. So people who work every day for us, for our energy consumption, and we won't have any more this very dense energy if we get rid of fossil fuels. So probably we will have to work anyhow more, because we don't have any more this energy slaves. So I think this would be very important to have more knowledge about, or what it would mean. So you are completely right. We will have a huge amount of work. But the other thing is that even if we work less, this doesn't mean we work less for paid work, but there is a huge amount of work which is not paid, and which, if we could do it, it would even increase our well-being. This means having the small garden. This means care for the neighbors, for the family. This could mean doing some voluntary work for environment and things like this. So that's why my colleague and in our last book about meaningful activity, we developed this idea: we should work less, but expand meaningful activities and increase access to such activities. So to have possibilities for people to be active when they work less for money, but also to increase the quality of life. Because we also have to see that voluntary work provides values which work against for money does not provide. For example, meaningfulness, autonomy. These are values which are not provided usually. You're not in that amount in paid work. So it's, even for our well-being, it's good to expand also on other activities. And there is a huge work because the community, the government, the society has to create such opportunities for meaningful activities.
Yes, you can answer, Julia, and then we can maybe switch to another one that is very important for us.
Yeah, and I think Irmi already started a bit, but I just want to say one thing. So I guess one thing is I don't like the term energy slaves because I'm American and there's a history. And,
okay, yeah.
but that's but I understand the point. But I think that that's something that actually there's we have lots of degrees of freedom in some ways. And one of the things is that when we're looking at fossil fuels, one of the things that I don't think people realize is how inefficient they are. So most fossil fuel supply chains, you lose 2/3 of it immediately from transforming it from primary energy to final energy. Because so just, from fossil fuels to electricity, from fossil fuels to motive power, you lose 2/3 of it. So it's massively inefficient. So in that sense, we might have this energy working for us, but 2/3 of them are off doing something completely useless, burning up the planet, whatever. Anyway, that's one thing. The other thing is that the conversion devices that we have at our disposal are getting more and more efficient. So we not only are we switching from massively inefficient fuels to much more efficient. I mean, yesterday the news came out that they're making that the advances in solar panel technology are extraordinary. I mean, a solar panel of 40% was just about. It's obviously not market ready, but this is insane, right? So we're moving to much more efficient production. And we also have much more efficient conversion once we have that production. So the amount, for the things we want, the amount of energy we need, and the way it's made is actually completely changing. So that it's not like that level needs to stay the same at all. There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of freedom there, and things are probably going in relatively good directions.
So this means that you think that it's not so much additional work we have because of the switch to other energy resources?
No, I think it's because, we need to, the efficient devices and the efficient ways of delivering them have to be built. That is work. But yes, but that's probably not very much. It's a one-time shift and then maintenance. So there's also a really interesting dynamics. I mean, Narasimha Rao, who works on decent living energy, he talks about build up and then maintenance. And so there's this idea that we have to change we have sort of have a capital turnover, or in the case of developing countries, just a capital buildup to allow people to have these decent living standards. But then the maintenance energy on an annual basis might not be very high. And we can model some of that. So we've started some of that, but it's very early days, I would say, in this work.
So there is also one more topic that we would like to address in this question of work. It is, as you said, we need to start from where we are. And in Switzerland, there is one very important topic. It is actually the first topic that comes always in the poll. It's the question of the pension system, because it's a huge mess in Switzerland. Just to remind the people that there was a reform already in 2017 that has been refused, and that now it is also one of the main questions at the center of the political action, because around this question, there is all the question of working more, but also on having a transition that is actually not good for everyone, and especially women. And in this country where we have a big social movement as a feminist strike, but also union, for us, climate strike, it's very important to have a stand on that. Because also at the basis of this system in Switzerland, there is mass investment in fossil fuels and many other stuff that are not good for the environment, but that actually help our social security to, stand on. And for us, actually, there is the question of, do we need to build a strong alliance against this, around this question? And also, there is one sub-question that is, at the end, if we get out of this growth-dependent paradigm, will we still have like a system that can work with the AVS, AHV? That's for us the first pillar. It is what is the best. The other one are useless. And like, can we still have something that is good for everyone? And the last one, and maybe then you can answer on whatever you want. It's complex, but we need to discuss it. We're also discussing about this second pillar that is massively invested. We're not going to ask 10 more years the people to invest it somewhere they don't want to. So the question is, can we, us, decide with a reform to take this and put it in the AVS or also on other sectors? For example, let's use this money for agriculture or to share it also with others. This is a central question for us. What is your opinion around that?
Shall I start? Okay, maybe Julia, you are still a little bit new for the Swiss pension system. No, the Swiss pension system is heavily dependent on economic growth. This is clear. This is a really capital-based pension. So this means only if there is growth, they can fulfill their promises, what they are going to pay. And actually, it is said that 60% of the money which is paid as pensions is in general from the market. And that's why we say that the market is the third contributor to the pensions. The first is the assured people, the employers, the employees, the employers, and the market. So this gives you an idea how important is the financial market and of course growth, because otherwise it couldn't be that much. So, and now the growth isn't happening anymore in this extent as in the last decades. And we really have to think that the pensions get reduced by easily 30% from the second pillar. So, there is a huge political pressure to change something. And realistic as I am, maybe too much, but I think there has to be a shift so that the second pillar gets more and more elements of the AHV, of the pay-as-you-go principle. And they are a little bit starting to discuss that, but not that much. But I think the pressure is increasing. And as you said, the money is used for stupid things. This is international investments. And if you see around us the bubble in housing now, it's also triggered by the pension funds. So at the moment, 20% of the capital of pension funds is in housing. And before it was, 15 years ago, it was less than 10%. So you see how they are increasing the bubble of immobilier. So I think recently I was told that the huge stumbling blocks in a reform are the trade unions. Because I was not aware of that, but the trade unions, they also decide on how to use the pension funds. So they are in the councils to decide what to do with the money. And for them, it's like employer participation. So change can only happen if trade unions go along. So it's not just the pension capitalists or the banks who have these funds, and so it's really the trade unions have to be included. So yeah, I think we have to, the earlier the better, to change the system. But then I have to say that even the AHV in I don't know what the French, you said it, the French ABS. At the moment already 20% of it are from the government. So the contributions are not enough for the payments that happen now. So we have to realize and to accept that more in the future, more public money will be needed to finance the AHV. But I think this is not, it's really not a problem, because there would be easily other sources of money. There is a wealth tax, there can be consumption tax, there can be environmental tax, heritage tax. There are quite a lot of possibilities to fund this. So I think this is not the biggest problem. But the society has to accept that the public has to supplement the AHV. Yeah, and I think, I mean, if you can raise this topic, I mean, that's just great, because I think the need to change, to really reform is recognized, but maybe kind of the eyes are turned away so far. But there must be a reform, that's for sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Julia, did you want to add something to this, or should I move on to the next topic? Or?
I would just add one short thing, which is I think that if you look at old age care, basically, one of the things that's very expensive is the labor that helps old people stay alive, stay at home, all of that. And that's again something where the fact that you have these social charges on labor, we're going to be, whether we want to or not, moving towards an aging society, towards a society where we have to just care for people because people won't be able to work anymore. And so one of the things we have to do is we have to stop making that prohibitive.
Yeah.
So again, this I would say that the pension issue, the work issue, these are not necessarily completely separate either.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe also I just spoke about the financial thing, but I think also we have to think how to partly maybe also replace the need for pensions. So how can we, I mean, there's discussion, how can we strengthen the immaterial contract between the generations? Now we have a material contract between the generation, but how to include immaterial points? And in the research on old age, this has been already discussed 10 years, and there are some ideas, but I think we have to go on develop that. And one point is, for example, this time change systems where you care for older people, and later when you are old by yourself, you get the time back. So this is one first thing, or intergenerational housing. So I think we have to, and I mean, there are a lot of niches where there is experiments. I think we have to use that and to see how can we scale that up so that at least the strong dependence on financial income to assure the age can be kind of maybe reduced or made less strong. And as Julia said, we also have to discuss all this point about the prices for care work. But I think I think the care discussion is important, but I think also we have to go in the direction how to increase the health and the well-being of the people. Because what we observe is that the number of years in which people live healthy is decreasing. So this is also a very important point, that the people can stay healthy and in a good shape. So Marion, I see already I'm coming up with more and more topics.
You're indeed coming up with more topics, but it's not necessarily a bad thing, because I think it gives a nice transition to the next point. I just want to say that there are many people asking loads of questions on the chat, and we're currently making sure that these questions will be asked at some point. And I want to tell everyone in the chat that we are looking at the questions, but we're going to put them at the points where we find they're most relevant. So don't think that we're ignoring your questions. But there are moments in discussion where they will fit in a bit more nicely. So I kind of wanted to shift, well, not shift away, because it's very related, because you mentioned a couple of times this idea of like well-being and the idea of redefining what we spend time on and redefining what could, in a sense, make us happy, or what kind of activities bring us happiness and well-being and healthiness, I guess. And that also relates to this idea of reducing working hours and potentially then taking away maybe the importance that work currently takes in our self-recognition, and how much work currently has so much meaning for us, and does that have to remain the same, or does that have to change? And I kind of wanted to ask this question to you of when we talked about work and we talked about values, what do you think are the values that need to be changed, or what are the values or what we consider in terms of well-being that needs to be emphasized if we are to be going towards a more degrowth society? Yeah, that's my question.
Okay, I mean, and that's obviously a very big question, and to some extent, I think one of the things that's interesting here is that this is not a question where, you know, we can answer, we can propose things, and then people have to decide. And I think one of the things that's very important here is this idea of democratic debate or democratic deliberation, which is a strong value in Switzerland. And in particular, I just want to advertise the work of a Swiss scholar, Antonietta Di Giulio, who's done this kind of work around doing surveys, asking people, would you agree to a change in norms around stopping overconsumption, for instance, so around sustainable consumption corridors? So would you be okay with legislation that would stop overconsumption, et cetera? So I think that that's really, really important, is to have these discussions, because if somebody just comes to you and says, hey, you're bad, you need to change the way your values are bad, you need to change the way you're doing things, that's not okay. But when we discuss it with each other, you know, like, I mean, I remember I have a friend who works in sustainability, and I remember the sustainable consumption fact, and I remember the day she realized that it meant her too. And she was like, wait a second, you know, you mean I can't fly around the world anymore? What's going on here? You know, so it's always a bit of a shock to the system, but if you start talking about it together, you find ways to do troubleshooting, you find ways to understand what a new or more desirable life could mean for you. And I think in terms of values, one of the things we don't realize yet, and that we don't have a very good education around, is how much our current values don't come from us. So how much we have not had this kind of discussion around the values that are currently dominant in our society. So even conservative parties who say, oh, we are for values, we are for holding the same values, they're not questioning where those values came from. And for instance, the value of consumerism or the values around growth, those were created about 100 years ago, very successfully, in a way that was with no discussion whatsoever. They were really sort of imposed from, you know, people always say, oh, you shouldn't have a planned economy, but we've been living in a world where consumerism is imposed on us without consent, without regulation, for a very long time. So I think that that's one thing, is just to open that space for discussion. And I think when you do that, so because I've done that, I've seen research projects where people do that. I've done that in my own research a few times. I've seen it happen, for instance, in citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries around climate change. What's really important is to ask people what they want as citizens and to let them discuss it together. And in terms of my research, we have this framework where we taken from the Chilean economist Manfred Max Neef, which is called human scale development, where you run these workshops where he has these sort of human needs, which include things like freedom and leisure, and, you know, things that not just food is there too, but other things as well. And where he basically asks people, how do you want to satisfy those needs? And you open that question, you say, how do you satisfy your needs now? How do you want to satisfy them in the future? And one of the things, and I think that people think, oh, basic needs are boring, or basic needs are like, it's just a basic life. Once you satisfy basic needs, you have freedom. That is the freedom that's necessary. It's not like overconsumption is not freedom. Constantly trying to get the next thing is not freedom. What you have, satisfying your multi-dimensional basic needs, that's when you can achieve things differently. So I think I think that we need to shift our values to recognize what's really important, to recognize that we owe it to each other, that we create that basis for a good life for each other. It's not just something that one person can do on their own. It's something that we create socially, and that the goal is to have this freedom. The goal is to have, the life chances that come with not having disastrous climate change. That's going to be pretty important, and having these basic needs satisfied. And then we have a lot of possibility there.
Maybe I add something. Yeah, I think, as Julia said, the discussion of values and becoming aware of the values and what is really important is very important. Is the ingredient for it, or the precondition for changing values. But then I think it's also important that values materialize, so that we can really feel that living differently is good. It's not just in the head. So, and I hear really often, I must now say, from old men, old white men, we have to change values. And I mean, even at WEF, they say, we have to change values. Yes, we need a value change. And I always get allergic, because really, because it's not just something in the head. From one day you switch and then you say you have new values. I mean, it's an important process, and you have to make the experience that other values assure your well-being. And so at the same time as we want to change the values, we have to change the possibilities so that the values can materialize, or you can realize that the values are valuable. So I think this is important, to have practical possibilities where the values can deploy.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point. There's a question on the chat related to this, and I thought it was a good moment to ask it. It's related to the idea of changing how we value work, for example, and what is the role of education in this maybe shifted values, and yeah, what role does education play in potentially changing this value? How would you answer to this question?
You mean the value on work?
Yes, I
or
think
value on work and education.
I think, how can education help changing this sort of value that we give to work? Or yeah, if that makes it more clear.
Yeah, I mean, now also the education, also in the school, we are very strongly educated to be successful, to be the leaders of tomorrow. I mean, the value that fulfillment comes from work. I mean, this is very widespread in our society. And I think that schools also contribute to quite a lot to that. So I think we have to be careful, because this can mean a lot of disappointment. I mean, there is now this interesting debate about meritocracy. How do you pronounce it in English?
Meritocracy.
Meritocracy, exactly. So where we are told if we work very well, we will arrive, we will have power, we will be successful, and we realize that that's not realizing in our societies anymore. So there's a lot of potential for disappointment, and also political disappointments. I think we have to keep that in mind. And then I think, to my opinion, the education has to turn in a way to provide us with qualifications for the meaningful activities. So this means for work for pay, but also for other activities like caring for others, like doing some agriculture work or do it yourself or things like this. So I think the education system has the task for a degrowth or a society, or for the transformation, to broaden up the qualifications, and as intellectual qualifications, but also craft and social qualifications. And I think this is very important, to be able to have to do work, for paid work, but also for these meaningful activities which we can do beside.
Yeah, so maybe just to the point on education, and I think there's an issue around education more broadly. By the way, there's a consultation open right now on secondary education, which I think economics education could be shifted in terms of its values, perhaps. So I think that there are opportunities that happen, and there's an opportunity right now. So anybody who's interested in participating in that, I think would be welcome. It would be a welcome effort. I think that maybe going to these activities, so the way that we think of school and the way that we think of work, we're still, all the institutions we have are left over from old problems. They're always solutions to problems we no longer have in some way, and they're not adapted to the new problems we have. So we always have to think of that a bit. And in terms of how we're going to live our life, if I think about how it's going to be possible to have this big transition where we need everybody's feedback, everybody's intelligence, really to try to navigate it, is that people are going to have different roles. So we have roles as citizens, we have roles as family members, we have all our normal roles, but in terms of our active life, so work, whether it's paid or unpaid, that we're going to have some kind of speciality, which is one thing we do with part of the time, but also these transversal activities. So I think that it's not just, because Irmi's been mentioning these voluntary activities or voluntary participation or meaningful unpaid work sort of outside of a job. But I think one of the things that's really important is participation in what I would call essential services or provisioning systems that have to do with how we live our base, the things that need to change. So if I think about it, somebody's going to have a job, but they're also going to be part of the energy board, or they're going to be part of the water board, or they're part of the urban system, like, how their neighborhood is organized. So people are going to have these civic activities that actually take up a fair bit of their time. And one of the things we're not taught very well, I mean, in Swiss education is, some I don't want to badmouth it because some of it's very good, but it's a question of how do we work together, teaching people to work together to reach these kinds of decisions, to work in new ways, to make these sort of collective, to be part of a collective decision-making process, but not like voting from time to time, but really being part of these decision-making bodies. I think that's going to be, I would say for a lot of people, that would be a big part of their time and their life, which is very rewarding actually in terms of value. That you're participating and making the life of other people better, more interesting, whatever. But it's also a lot of time, and it's skills, right? It's a lot.
Yeah, you're completely right. When we develop this idea of meaningful activities, it's of course also political and civic activities. And I mean, as you said, this should be, I mean, this is important, and it takes a lot of time. Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is what you are doing, the climate strike people. I mean, you are doing unpaid civic activities, which is most important. Yeah. Yeah.
We're trying our best. And now we can maybe shift to the last part. And thank you again for all the meaningful questions. We're going to use them right now, actually. So it's all the question about how do we implement and have like an inclusive transition, and especially that we like ensure that the already marginalized group aren't affected more negatively by a degrowth transition. And to start on that, I will ask, I think I will read some of the questions because they are all connected to the question of the global south. And I think it's a very important issue to tackle with the degrowth movement. So I will just read them. First is, how does the degrowth in industrialized countries work when you have exported most of your industry and exploitation to global south country? And then there are different ones. For example, how do we push for degrowth in industrialized country when those in power are also the one who will lose the most of it degrowth happen? And for the global south, how do we ensure that countries in the global south aren't forgotten in the degrowth movement? How do we make sure that the global south doesn't suffer economically? And the last one is, considering the global south economy depends in a way on global north, consuming so many goods produced there, how do we make sure global south is okay while global north reduce cons? So then there is like an interrogation about how do we perhaps relocalize the production? How do we make that? So yes, it's a lot. I think it's a question you can try to answer. Yeah.
Who starts? I start? Yeah. Yeah, that's really a big thing, a big question on the degrowth and global south. So just to begin with, once I was discussing with somebody from the south, and I said, yeah, of course, growth might not be suitable because there are environmental problems and other things. How about development? And then this person said, no, I mean, development has such negative connotations, but actually what we need everywhere in the south and in the north is good livelihood. So I think maybe we should come away from this discussion whether growth is needed in developing countries or in low and medium income countries, but rather how can good livelihoods be assured? And this shifts the whole topic. Then we don't stick to this, do we need growth or not? And of course, I mean, many of these people, of these countries need basic structures of basic infrastructure, or basic services like health, schooling, electricity, water, and things like this. I mean, this is without doubt. And of course, these sectors have to grow in these countries. The other question is whether the industrial production for the global north has to increase. And then we are at the question, who suffers if there is degrowth here? And I mean, who is suffering? Of course, we see that now in the Corona crisis are the people who do not get any more the salaries, but the dependence of their salaries from a huge amount of clothes, I mean of excessive clothes, which are dumped here, is not a concept which can survive in the future. So this concept is anyhow, we would have to change. We cannot go on with the work division of labor which we have now, because it's really detrimental for us and in these countries. So the structures also have to change there, so that if we have degrowth or growth independent here, this would also mean that the relations between the countries is put on a new level anyhow. And it's clear that there has to be social justice or much less inequality as we have now. But also a lot of the inequality which we have is within these countries now. I mean, if you look at China or at India, so it's also a task of these countries. But of course, that there are groups which are incredibly rich is because they are trading with the global north, or because these people can put their money on global finance markets. Of course, we are also involved. Yeah, so these are just a few ideas. I don't have the solution, but I mean, what is important that we distinguish between different countries, because the situation is quite different, I think. And yeah, with the growth or growth independence here, we also have to look what it means for these countries.
So yeah, so just to follow on from that, because there were a lot of questions, obviously. I just want to raise the point that one of the things we didn't talk about in the values section were raised also here in this question of transition, which is some values that we might have are values around justice and reparative justice, restorative justice, around decolonizing, around understanding the role of history in all of this, which I think is quite important. So one of the things I taught this semester was Jason Moore's Capital and the Web of Life. And the students were really responsive to that, because they're like, oh, it's not just that it's happening, it's coming from somewhere. It's coming from these early stages of capitalism, not just industrialization. You know, in the early stages of capitalism were around colonization. So I think we have to go back to understand these historical processes. And one of the people I would really recommend reading here is Jason Hickel. So he recently wrote a book called Less is More, where he covers a lot of ground, and it's extremely readable. But he's also recently published an article where he quantified with a colleague the wealth transfers from south to north. So the point is that we are, as industrialized economies, we often have this idea of, oh, we give aid to the South and we give them money for employment. You know, we give them money because we send money over there because we buy goods that are manufactured there. But the fact is that the net flow of money goes north because of debt, because of sovereign debt and other kinds of debt that have to do with financial, not necessarily governments, but financial institutions in the global north. So if you look at the amount of money that's flowing in the world, it is flowing from south to north. And even though aid is more like a Band-Aid, actually. It's like trying to hide this generational crime that's still ongoing. And so one of the things that we can, that is an immediate thing that we can demand and make very strong political demands for, is to stop this crime, to stop this economic crime. So countries, one of the reasons that countries in the global south are dependent on trade, dependent on consumerism in the global north, et cetera, is because we force them to be stuck in this economic system in debt bondage. And so that's just something that needs to stop. I mean, there's no way that we can have a sensible economic system in this kind of way. It's stealing money from them. It's causing them to be perpetually in underdevelopment. It's in some cases specifically and explicitly preventing them from investing in public infrastructure like health and education. I mean, it's just a crime. So we need to stop it. So that's something that I think should be a central demand of the climate movement, of the degrowth movement, of anybody who has a soul, to be honest. So I think that that's one issue. The other is around what this new economy looks like. So the fact is that in the global south, there are a lot of resources and there's a lot of money. The problem is there's a problem with distribution, as Irmi pointed out. You know, the wealth inequality is very great, land inequality, et cetera. There's the problem that they're still in an extractive situation where we get money from them. But then the question is, if you deal with some of these, we manage somehow to deal with some of these issues, the new economies that we're talking about are based on decentralized technologies to a large extent. So that's actually good. That means that there's no reason that that energy can't be delivered in a decentralized way, in an equitable way. There's no reason, and the same for other infrastructures around communication, sanitation, water supply. I mean, the things that people need, most they can get. And then there's also, anything that to do with health and education, that's extra investment that is made easier if they're not trapped in this international trade system, which right now is extreme, where the rules of the game are completely rigged against them. So that's one point to make. In terms of the degrowth, so I don't, the question of whether or not GDP grows or degrows, I think we need to have economic systems that are safe for degrowth. So I'm very much aligned with that post-growth perspective in that sense. But in terms of resource use and emissions, there's been this idea, developing countries need to have a higher carbon budget per capita than industrialized ones so that they can develop, and then they need to decarbonize. And I think that is no longer true. I think that the low carbon technologies are cheap. They might not be available, but they're certainly cheap. So it's possible to go straight for decarbonized infrastructure, decarbonized generation. That's one thing. The other thing is the energy conversion technologies. So LED lights, very efficient housing with passive cooling, which is very important in a lot of countries. These things are possible to develop locally. And you don't necessarily need to go through a high carbon phase, depending on what you're doing. So I guess those elements of what you're going to make with what is your development going to consist in. Things could go in many different directions. Right now, there's a lot of development that's happening that's very fossil fuel intensive, very coal intensive, and often it actually goes with corruption as well. So very often the fossil fuel direction of development also goes very strongly with centralized elites who like to concentrate power and have a lot of wealth. So these two things are not completely separate. And there's some work that Will Lamb has done on these kinds of issues that I think is really important to understand the political economy that's orienting that. So maybe that went in lots of different direction, but I think it's, I guess basically just one more thing I'd say is that we've sort of calculated, Narasima Rao has done work on this, and my group has done some work on this, on the amount of energy it would take to have a decent living standard. And a lot of global South countries have to grow. Like a lot of global South countries, even at the most efficient technology possible, they're still in deficit. But a lot of them are not. So that's another thing, is again, there's a lot of potential there. It's about distribution, it's about how it's used. And I had one more thing to say. Oh yes, because we've done studies specifically on, or rather Marta Baltrushevitz, who's a PhD student in the Living Well Within Limits project, has done household level studies on Zambia, Nepal, and Vietnam. So very poor countries, and Vietnam is sort of a middle country maybe. And one of the things that's really interesting is that poor households use more energy on residential, more energy for cooking and heating and so on than rich households do. So you actually, the energy use goes down the richer you are in developing countries, because it's about access to electricity, access to efficient conversion devices. So even right now, we see that as those countries, as households get more prosperous, they use less energy in the home. Then they use more energy for transport and other stuff. That's a separate, but you already see this sort of transition happening. So I think that that's also something to think about.
Thank you. I think these were super interesting points, and especially also you brought up already, let's say, a concrete measure or a concrete demand that one could make, I guess, also in the context of what we're as a group trying to do. And I kind of wanted to then take this discussion on inclusiveness also to, let's say, the more local aspect of it, in the sense that we're now a group of let's say people who want to create this degrowth tradition, and we're here based in Switzerland, and we want to write a set of measures for it. How can we and should we be inclusive in that process of within our country itself? What voices need to be heard, and how do we make sure that this definition of these measures is done on an inclusive way where we are as well? And I wonder if you had thoughts on this question.
Just a question to understand. Inclusiveness means for you including different groups of the society.
Yes.
It's not that much, it's inclusive concerned financial questions, but inclusiveness of mainly in this, now it's, society.
I think it's
society.
a bit of, I think it could be, because it's including, I meant it like inclusive in the sense that who gets to think about these things, and how do we make sure that like the group of people decide, like thinking about this topic is inclusive, but also that the measures themselves don't reflect one side only. And then financially also, how do we make sure that the less able financial people are also involved in the measure? But it's a bit broad, but it's about both, if that's okay.
I mean, I think a lot, to my opinion, we are so slow in advancing the transitions, because the logics of the subsystems in which we live, our system is incredibly complex, and the subsystems are also complex, and they don't come together. I would approach it in this way. And I mean, if you want to change the social or the pension funds, you have other actors than if you want to do something for the health system or for agriculture. It's still something else. So I think inclusiveness, I think this would be the first step to assure to approach that. Yeah, and then of course, I mean, you have to see that there are different creativity, different ages, different social groups, gender, and also this heterogeneity in ideas and creativity has to be integrated. So I think I would look at it in these two ways. Yeah.
Yeah, so maybe I can just say a couple of things that come from maybe the US formulation of the Green New Deal and some of the principles behind that, and also the citizens juries that I was invited to be part of as an expert. But I think you need, basically one of the things that's really important here is if you want to do a good job, you have to have overrepresentation of vulnerable groups. And vulnerable groups might be, you know, families with young children, or old age pensioners, or refugees, migrants, disabled people, I think is really important, because a lot of what we're talking about is changing transport systems, for instance. What does that mean for them? So I think that's in terms of the, you know, people from different racial, geographic backgrounds. Somebody from the Valais has a different perspective than somebody from Bern or whatever. So I think that you have all these different perspectives, and they really help as long as people are focused on this idea of, okay, how are we gonna, once we know we need to change things, then we get to work. And I think it's also really helpful to have people there who have experience as users of the welfare state, for instance, or social security, because at least, for instance, in the UK, which I know a bit better, but I think here it's not always so different. There's a huge amount of lack of dignity that goes with being part of those systems, you know? So people, you have to be part of it. You have to play by those rules, but they don't necessarily treat you very well, and they don't necessarily help you design that system. So I think that there's also something there about a popular demand. And the idea of the popular demand, maybe this goes in a direction of being more expansive than what Irmi was saying, that sometimes you're stronger when you're able to make demands that multi-solve is a way of thinking about it in terms of system thinking, where you basically take all these problems, but then you also think about cutting through the problems and using sort of general popular solutions. And so the job guarantee is one of those, or free healthcare is another one of those. So things that give people security, things that, you know, are going to provide people with work, with the means to live, with dignity. So the demands that you can make can cut across the different systems that are malfunctioning sometimes. And if you get a program that's popular enough, it's not going to pass the first time. You know, it's not going to pass as such, but it's going to take over. So that's the goal, right? So Joe Biden will never say he's in favor of the Green New Deal, but because the Sunrise Movement was so intelligent in the way they acted, campaigning against him, and then discussing with his people, and then campaigning for him, like the way they sort of corralled him, and now his policies are effectively their policies. But he's never going to call it that, you know. That's not what victory looks like. But I think that it's about creating this general program that creates debate, that creates a different vision, and then gets sort of translated into the party platforms, that then gets translated through into the society. So, but to do that, you have to be very creative and very inventive, and you have to refuse to sacrifice people. The reason the Green New Deal came about the way it was is because one of the people involved from the word go was Rihanna Gunn-Wright, who comes from the south side of Chicago, grew up with asthma, you know, brilliant young Black woman, but suffering from environmental racism, huge amounts of pollution there, et cetera. So, and then she was like, we're not going to sacrifice anybody anymore. We're not going to tell anybody it's not their turn. Right now, we're in a crisis time, but it's going to be everybody's turn. We're not going to say you need to stay poor, you need to stay at the back of the line. We'll get to you after we deal with climate, okay? Because that's not how social progress works. And because she refused to do that, she came up with a program that was really popular and really transformative. And that's happening now. I mean, they're doing things against child poverty now in the US. That was unimaginable for decades. So it's just, anyway, from that perspective, I have a lot of, I now have a lot more respect for really transformative political programs, because sometimes they win. Because they're so popular, because they're so controversial and then popular.
Thank you. That's very interesting. I wanted to ask on something that was mentioned at the very beginning by you, Irmi. It was about this the tax system reform, and I thought it would be a good point to come back on, in the sense of now we're thinking on these sort of more concrete transition plan that we want to create, and hopefully a transformative plan, as you said, Julia. And I wanted to ask a bit more on the role that this change in tax system would be, and what can we concretely ask about it, or how could we ask for a change, and what kind of change should that be if we want to include that in our plan?
I think the main question is to have a more ecological tax system, but also one which eases the taxes, the fees, which has to be paid for work. So I think this is the major things. Then there can be redistribution. I mean, also in Switzerland, the tax of taxing capital has been reduced. So I mean, the tax system should also contribute to more equality. And then I think these are the main demands. And then I have worked on subsidies. So there is a huge amount of subsidies in Switzerland which are environmental damaging. And this is also a part of an ecological tax or finance reform, that these subsidies are either abolished or changed so that they don't harm anymore that much the environment. And what I also observe is that our tax system is incredibly complex and bureaucratic. So for example, if you look now with the CO2 law, we are going to get this Flugabgabe for flights, the additional fee for flights. But at the same time, we don't pay the Mehrwertsteuer, the value added on flights. I mean, it's really absurd. We have so many reductions on taxes on flights. We don't pay for we don't pay any mineral tax for the petrol. So we have a lot of measures which reduce, and then we add a little bit and call it Flugabgabe. So there would be a lot of kind of overhaul and make the tax system much more transparent and much more easy to access. Because also, I mean, in the tax system, when I look at all these tax reductions and exemptions, this is kind of interest groups and powerful who profit from that. So yeah, in your place, I think I would ask for a tax finance reform which reduces the environmental burden, which also includes subsidies, and which increase social justice and reduce inequalities and eases the taxing of work and of labor.
Maybe like a question that is linked to that, because it's very interesting, is that we also discussed about this question a little bit, and there was like two steps. Like, what can we do immediately? Like, which one can we bring that is so concrete that we can also make people understand it is feasible and show that it is, and like build popular support around? Because in my opinion, like doing this huge package, also we could agree on, is like too much.
Yes, you are right. But what is the huge problem is that we don't have really good plans how to change the tax system. I mean, we have this idea that we have to increase the taxes on the environment and so, but so far the fiscal experts, I mean, once they have developed a tax system, which then when Maurer came to power, he put it in the drawers. So I think I would ask to retake this tax reform proposal and to update it and to work on it. I think this could be an idea, because I think it's good to ask for certain things, but the tax system we have now is from the 50s. And there always have been incremental small changes. But I think we should also discuss about a more fundamental overhaul. So I think asking for taking up again the tax reform, which was already discussed. I think it was until 15 or something, 2015, and update that with the present requirements. I mean, with the climate change debate and biodiversity debate. And maybe something which hasn't been investigated at all is, unfortunately, is the growth drivers due to the tax system. You know, because I mean, the taxes, if you look at arguments for tax reforms in the last 20, 30, 40 years, all reforms or requirements were justified with it increases economic growth. So actually, a large part we would have to draw back. So, for example, if an enterprise, my hairdresser, my hairdresser refurbished his whole rooms, and then I said, "Why do you do it? It's still nice." And he said, "Yeah, my tax advisor, counselor, he told me I should do this for the taxes." So you see, if enterprises have debts, reinvest, it's good for his or her taxes. So there are drivers which give incentives to refurbish, to change, to grow, and things like this. And it would be really important to look at that, which taxes have these effects. Yeah, and so far, really, I don't know anybody who is looking into that.
Thank you. That's actually something quite concrete that we can then think about and include. So that's a really good point. Julia, did you want to say something about this, or should I? Okay, perfect. I wanted to ask another question more on the concrete proposals or ideas that one could have. And linking back to then the second topic where we talked more about values and how to, for example, go away from this overconsumption value or this idea of always wanting more or needing material things. And I guess we want people to agree on this change of value, and somehow we potentially could have measures or demands or things that we could ask that could help this change of value. There has been the proposition of, for example, banning advertisement. I've read this a couple of times. What do you think of this? Do you have any ideas on how one could ask for concrete demands that would lead to helping this shift in values or away from overconsumption, for example?
I think a ban in advertising doesn't sound bad at all, but or maybe, you know, maybe having a sort of real warning, sort of a realism warning on advertising. But I think, have you ever wondered? I mean, at some point I was like, when I realized how this overconsumption was driven by advertising, I was wondering, hey, why didn't they teach us about that in school? Wouldn't it have been important to understand how to decode advertising? And if you see this message that's appealing to you because it uses a certain image or something that's appealing to you, that it's actually manipulation. That in fact, they're not selling the thing that's appealing to you, they're selling their own profits, right? And I was thinking about why not? And because it takes, once you tell somebody the advertising is not for you, it's for them, right? They're not doing it out of the goodness of their heart, actually, because they're your best friend. They're doing it because it serves their own interests. It really changes the way you react. And the reason that it doesn't happen is maybe, again, because, you know, this tax, the same as what Irmi was saying, because of the tax system before, is it's there to drive growth. It's there to help industry. And so that we have a society where we're sort of supposed to be easy to manipulate because it serves industry for overconsumption. So in terms of, to get back to your point around specific measures, I think one of the things is that this change goes back to a change in culture. One thing I really recommend, if people haven't done it yet, is watching this documentary series. It's available on BBC, four documentary series available on YouTube called The Century of the Self, which documents the rise of consumerism through the theories of Freud as used in the public relations and advertising industry, which he helped found by his nephew, Edward Bernays. And it really changes the way you see the world. So I think that one of the things that you need to realize is that if you want to go up against overconsumption, which is one of the things we need to do, you're talking about a change in culture. And if you're accompanying a change in culture, you have to be as intelligent as Edward Bernays, the man who did it 100 years ago, give or take, and think about these kinds of strategies. So it's it's not just about moralizing, it's about making it line up with what people want, line up with core values. So what he did is he took people's core values and core desires and he translated them through consumerism. He was like, these things that are good and legitimate, that you are legitimately desire and want, you will get them through consumption. You will get them through smoking, through, all kinds of whatever, not very nice things. So you need to go back to those core values, the core values of freedom, of self-expression, of fulfillment. You need to translate that into, you will definitely not get it through consumerism. You will get it through these other things, these other activities, this new vision of society that's around protecting each other from this disaster that's happening, in part because of overconsumption. So it's really about I would say it's a lot of this idea of going up against overconsumption is about blowing up the work of Edward Bernays, who made consumption the way we achieve human need satisfaction. And if you think about it from the perspective of Manfred Max Neef, who is a Chilean economist, he has this idea of doing, having, doing, and interacting as strategies for fulfilling human needs. Having is only one strategy. You have these other strategies that are available to you. So it's like, use those strategies when you're you need to shift people to another positive thing where they understand that that consumerism is a dead end and not what they want and does not serve their purposes, and where they gain autonomy, freedom. I think it's an interesting challenge. I don't have an easy answer here, but I think that that's one of the things to think about.
May I add something? I'm a very favorite of quality, and I think overconsumption has led to really a dramatic fall of quality. I mean, look at all the textile sector. I mean, the textiles are so bad that they stop collecting them in Germany now. We have worse other things like, I mean, all the technical device and so. So I think having a higher quality in everything should be pushed forwards, and things that can be repaired. And the second market, second-hand market. So a couple of days ago, I saw in the news, in the French news, that in France, second-hand is really exploding now, and municipalities are obliged, or will be obliged, to buy 20% of their public procurement in second-hand. So I think these are really good steps towards limiting the overconsumption, because then you reduce just the amount of things that are used, and of course you create also really good jobs in the repair sector. So I think there is this debate about repair. I mean, Switzerland is behind that. We should really push that things can be repaired. Then pushing the second-hand market. I mean, why not obliging also Swiss municipalities or cantons to buy second-hand things? So we could develop this sector. And then I think also overall, we should develop and expand this idea of having good quality things, and which can be repaired, which have durability, and which are not just which do not decay within a couple of days. And I mean, this touches also the values that Julia has spoken of, because it's kind of, if you repair, you have Selbstwirksamkeit, how do you say, efficacy, self-efficacy, that you know you can create something, you can change something, you have values of beauty, and of many people also, I mean, they don't want to buy every 4 years a refrigerator, but they are quite happy if they have them 15 years or something. I mean, it could also ease our life quite a lot. So I think in this direction, beyond developing values, there are also practical possibilities to reduce the overconsumption. And then there is the whole debate about, I mean, sufficiency in municipalities. Municipalities can provide public services like libraries, do-it-yourself centers, and all that stuff, so that the consumption of the people can reduce the consumption. Yeah.
So we have one more question coming from the chat, and it's really related to the situation we're in right now. It's, how could a massive economic crisis be a political opportunity for system change? And the second one is, can we, as post-growth proponents, prepare for this opportunity? And maybe we could add something to that, is preparing for what? Because that's often what lacks. So what do you think about this question?
Julia, you are still here? Or?
Yeah, well, we're in an economic crisis right now.
Yes.
We're in a massive crisis. Can you hear me? Because you're frozen, yes. So I'm wondering.
Yes, we hear you.
We hear you, but your camera
is
kind
it
of
okay
freezes.
or not?
I think it's fine. Your audio is fine.
Okay,
your
great.
video is lacking.
Okay. So sorry about that, but
it's gonna.
Yeah, now it's Julia. Are you back? Well, Irmi,
maybe I start
maybe
and
you start.
Julia, I start and Julia will come in. So economic crisis like this one brings opportunity, but also disadvantages. We don't know what are the results. I mean, there are a few points which go really in the direction we want to, but there are other dimensions and other development demands which we do not want at all. So we don't, I mean, it will be very diverse, the effects. But what I think, what we have to prepare for crisis, to have the knowledge that when the crisis comes, which is a window of opportunity, to come in or to have already discussed ideas so that they can take roots. And I think this is really the most important things. We have to be prepared, have big discussions, concepts which can be applied when the crisis is there. And I mean, in the future we will have crisis. This is not the last crisis. I mean, this is now a sanitary crisis, but we will also have economic crisis, or crisis triggered by economic effects. Like, I mean, the banking and finance system, I don't know what, there's a big danger that this will kind of collapse. So we don't have to trigger the crisis; they will come by themselves. And but I think we have to prepare kind with ideas, and then maybe a part of it will be taken up. Yeah.
Let's see if Julia is back or not. Let's then keep going so that we don't, we hope she will come back. Irmi, I had another question again on, let's say, coming back to the concrete measures and coming back to different things we've raised before. And I think a central question that kind of always comes back and we always discuss is the idea of the universal basic income, or different kinds of salaire à vie, or like income for life. what do you think of this, or in these aspects, what would be a measure that you would want to ask, let's say, or what is your preferred version of it, if any?
I'm not in favor of the basic unconditional income, but I'm favorable of a basic income on conditions, and conditions could mean jobs. I mean that there are activities, and that people. I mean it goes in. It may be in the direction of a job guarantee, but I would not call it job guarantee, but rather creating jobs, creating possibilities for activities that are important to be done and provide income. I think I would go in this direction. I'm not favorable of an unconditional basic income, because I think that being integrated in a working or activity process can be very useful for different reasons I can't develop now. And also, I mean, the people around me, a couple of people say that unconditional basic universal income is difficult to finance. And then also, I started to be critical about the basic income when I talked with Binswanger. I don't know whether you know this name. Hans-Christoph Binswanger was an important Swiss economist who developed the idea of ecological tax reform. And he said, if you have a basic general income, this will be a driver for growth. And I think that he is right. So, because you have to create the money, or you have to get it somewhere, and there's a chance that it's done by increasing the productivity and increasing the output. So I think we have to really think quite well on that. And yeah, I'm more in favor of this revenu de transition économique or transition sociale. And I think to do that, the government or the community has a role or should create such possibilities. Yeah.
So
Cool, thank you.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Stephen. Yeah.
I wanted to make a comment because on another group also that we work on alternative economy, we discussed about that and we come near to the same conclusion. And right now we are much more talking about this revenu de transition écologique. So it's an idea from Sophie Swatton, if you want to have a look at it, that is also applied in different ways and in different territories. So it's very concrete. And there was also someone from the University of Lausanne, but I don't have the name right now, that said that such a revenu de transition écologique should be pushed by the state, financed by it, and implemented locally, as we have already like a decentralized system. And I think it's an idea we should really try to think if it's possible, because this will be, I think, very feasible in our system and bring a lot of change.
And maybe to add, yeah, exactly. There is a lady from from London, Anne Cote, from the New Economic Foundation, and she recently published a book, and it's about basic universal services. And she doesn't favor the basic income, but basic services. And she said we need services for health, for education, and things like this. And that's what we should provide. And I think I support this idea. And now in Switzerland, the SP, the party, the Social Democrats, they come also with this idea, service public, to strengthen the service public. And I mean, to do that, you can also create jobs and strengthen that. And it's service public, it's not just the buses that are running, but also, yeah, education and care and things like this. Yeah.
Thank you. So I think we're getting to the end. So I wanted to ask Julia again, you kind of can decide what you want to answer on. There was the previous question who was again on the potential of an economic crisis for bringing up change. And the second one, which I think you were a bit frozen when we asked it, was about the central question of universal basic income, which kind of always comes back, or what kind of other job security principles can we implement or should we push for, and which one is, let's say, your favorite if you have one. So I don't know, on these two topics you can kind of decide which one you want to take on.
I'm a big fan of Anna Koot and universal basic services, so I'll support that. I guess I would just wanted to say something about the idea of crisis and what we do about that. And I think that one of the things that seemed to me is that in the last financial crisis of 2008, it seemed like it still seemed like there wasn't an alternative program somehow. It was like, oh, well, we should use this opportunity to change things, but it wasn't like, oh, here's your 10-point program, go. So there was sort of a disconnect. It was like, oh, come on, everything's broken. We need to reform everything. I mean, except for like regulating the financial sector and things like that, which definitely should happen. But I think that now we are in an economic crisis for sure, worldwide. But we have something that's much closer to a 10-point program. We have, really good ideas around strengthening social fabric and making things more environmentally sustainable and changing taxation and work regimens. We have lots of shovel-ready policies proposals, and some of them are being implemented piecemeal in different places. But we still haven't been able to seize the moment to change things. And this has to do with power. And there was a question about power that I didn't really answer last time. So I just wanted to touch on that, is that good ideas are not enough. We could have the best ideas. We could have the best utopian future, and it could all work out, and the math could be fine, and everything could be splendid, and it would all be great, and we still would not win because of going up against power. So I think that there needs to be an interplay of both, which is the good ideas and the alternative program, but also having a strategy to build power to counter these forces that oppose change. And those forces are the ones that are in power right now. In Switzerland, they are very dominant in terms of the financial sector and other actors. So we need to be very realistic about that, because if we one of the problems with the climate movement is like, or not the climate movement, but the climate academia, I would say the movement's been great. The academia's been terrible. But is that, all we need to do is implement a carbon price or a carbon tax. And then you just ramp it up just a bit over time. And then the fossil fuel companies disappear. And it's like, no, they're going to stop us before we ever get there, because we have not named the enemy. So I think that part of the process of gaining political victory is also having a good communication strategy about who you're going up against and how you're going to deal with that. And again, the Sunrise Movement and Extinction Rebellion even have been a lot more effective than previous efforts to just sort of be nice, because they've been willing to say, hey, we're building strength. Our strategy is to build strength so that we overcome this resistance that's an entrenched vested interest. So I think it's not just a crisis, it's an opportunity. The crises have always been opportunities, and they've always been used by the worst actors in society to make even more money and take wealth away from other people. Like the financial crisis in the US was a large wealth redistribution program away from Black families, and they took everything from them. They took their homes away and gave it to like rich Wall Street bankers. Like that's what it was, So the crisis will be used. We only get to use the crisis if we build a counter movement.
Exactly. And on that, we will go to the conclusion. And I have to do some moment to publicize what is happening right now, because there is a strike for future. And it's the right time to go into the street. And as you know, so the strike for future is a movement that was initiated by the climate strike, but that build alliances with also the feminist strike, with Extinction Rebellion, with unions, with NGOs, with different local groups also. So we're really only at the start, but on the 21st of May, there will be many programs in Switzerland. So please look at the map. You can go to Strike for Future, Grève pour l'Avenir, and find something near your home. If you don't find it, you can do whatever you want. You can follow the program. You can do a climate alarm, social alarm at 1 to 12, because it's really close. We're close to the end. And then join like demo that are organized. But also before, you can already join, like there is the 1st of May, this Saturday. and many climate strikers will join this protest because it's very important to build power together. And also there will be like a first a Moby weekend on the 8th and 9th of May. And then there is 1 week also you need to book if you want to go into civic disobedience, and you can also help the people working on that. It's from the 28th of July till the 11th of August. So something might happen and will happen. So please book this date. It will be very fun. If you remember what happened in September last year, it was amazing. It will be even better. So that's what I wanted to tell you. And then I give it to Marion for the end.
Great advertisement. Yeah, thanks, Stephen. So it's 8:58, and I think it's great that we're on time so that people and us can be done at 9 as we had planned. But so I really want to thank both of you for being with us today and having answered a set of very diverse questions, going to some structured way to maybe some unstructured way in some ways. But I think for us, at least, I don't know, I can talk for myself, but I think it was very informative on also answering crucial questions that we had in mind. And I think towards the end, we got to some concrete measures that I think are really valuable to be able to have in our pockets when writing this sort of plan. And especially when we go into other theories for change, like alternative economies, then I think a lot of the things that we talked about make sense together in a way. And I think slowly we're going to be able to build something, a list of demands that makes sense. And also your point, Julia, having a set, like a plan that's really transformative and having different visions included is also super valuable for us. So I hope that people who watched us enjoyed the discussion. Obviously it would have been better offline, but by now we got used to it. So and I think if nobody has anything else to add, I would just finish by saying that if anybody on the stream wants to join our system change group and contribute to the work we're doing, we absolutely need people. And I think probably somebody from the team has by now sent a form on the chat where you can just leave your contact details so that we can get working together. And we obviously need as many people as possible because this is a massive, massive plan that we're having in mind. So yeah, it's perfectly 9. So I wish everyone a good evening, and we should now be able to end the stream. So bye-bye, everyone. And thank you for joining the call.